Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. We are excited to have you listeners here today. My name is Jonathan Edens. I'm a psychiatric PA, and I am here with one of our co-hosts that you all know and love. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Katie Cruz. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist.
Excellent. So today we will be discussing a cornerstone of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's one of the techniques that we will often, as clinicians and therapists, be utilizing during our therapy sessions without you necessarily knowing that we are doing this particular technique, right? But this can definitely be something that you don't necessarily have to do only with a therapist. It can be something that you do on your own. So understanding the technique and understanding how to apply said technique in your own life can definitely be a useful part of your mental health journey. To just, I guess, say what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about what's called Socratic questioning. So, Katie, why don't you go ahead and take the mantle and give us a brief introduction on this discussion?
Yeah, so whenever we talk about thoughts, it's helpful to think, kind of zoom out for a moment and realize, wow, we have tons of thoughts. And researchers can't really pinpoint exactly something as low as 6,000 to as high as 60,000. And some of my ruminators out there, I'm pretty sure it's more than 60,000. But then within that, they average that 80% of our thoughts are negative. And so
True.
we have this huge problem, right? With tons of thoughts, tons of those thoughts are negative. And then what I realized for a lot of people is most people don't ever examine their thoughts. And so this is a strategy that we can start examining our thoughts as well as to change them. And one of the things that, I want to emphasize in this episode with Socratic questioning is, yes, we want to change those thoughts, and that's important, but also how do I develop a mindset, an ability to think critically, an ability to think independently, an ability to really examine my thoughts for myself. Because if we can teach people to do that, right, then they're not dependent on therapy. And sometimes it's easy to be dependent on others and like, oh, is this thought truthful? Is it not? But we want people to develop that for themselves. And so I'm really excited to talk about Socratic questioning, not just a technique, as you mentioned, that we use, but for people to be able to utilize that for themselves.
Yeah, what's really great about this particular technique is it's not that complicated, right?
Exactly.
It's easy. It's relatively easy to understand. It may be a little bit harder to put into practice, especially if this is not necessarily something you've been used to doing. So it takes a little bit of time to develop the skill, but everybody can, right? Everybody can develop that skill to be able to do this. And sometimes it's might start with memorizing some of the questions that we as mental health providers might use, holding on to those and then practicing with those particular questions. So let's start with a brief sort of definition, if you will. What is Socratic questioning exactly?
So Socratic questioning is a bigger kind of term. So we're going to kind of define it in a big picture and then kind of narrowly focus it on therapy. But it's an educational method that was, coined after Socrates, a Greek philosopher that used this himself, both a philosopher and a teacher. And is really his method of teaching of helping people discover their own answers, right? Answering their own questions and discovering their own answers. Instead of, if you think about a lot of times with teaching, many teachers will just give the answer. But he wanted to not just have them arrive at the answer, but to help them to think in a way that they could arrive at their own answer, which I think is just a powerful technique that you see if you study any other great teachers. They also applied this method, including Jesus as a teacher, but many different historical figures use this technique to teach and to teach well.
So why is it important for us to be able to do this on our own, right? Or to be able to come up with our own answers? Because I can understand how that would be otherwise challenging. Because it's like, well, I already like I'm asking I'm asking somebody else because I want to know their answer to the question, right? And so. Especially in this day and age where it's so easy to have somebody or something like artificial intelligence give you the answers to things, like why do we need to be able to use this, or what's really the purpose of this at this point?
So great question. And sometimes when I'm supervising, I can sense the frustration of my supervisees because they're just like, give me the answer, right?
Mm,
So, in one kind of, this isn't the main purpose, but it's a side purpose. It does develop patience for sure, because it is, especially in this day and age with instant gratification. Hey, Google, hey, Siri, whatever it may be, we want an instant answer. But this really, if you think about the analogy, or sometimes people use this where they say, I want to teach you how to fish instead of just give you the fish. Why? Because I then allow you to, you're going to be fed for the rest of your life. And so it's a better teaching method that really promotes independent thinking, critical thinking, higher level thinking. And then one part that I really love of the purpose of Socratic questioning is ownership over your own ideas and thoughts. Because if we just simply ask someone else, yeah, if we're asking, we don't want to take this so far to say that we can never give people answers. But if we only look for their answer, we're never developing our own ideas, our own thoughts. I even notice that sometimes people ask someone for their opinion before they've even formed their own. And so
yeah.
this method, one of the purposes of it is to really enable and empower. I would really emphasize that word, empower a person. So for a teacher, it'd be empowering a student. For a therapist, it'd be empowering a client. For a parent, it would be empowering their child to be able to develop that independent will and that independent way of thinking, their own mindset, their own ideas, their own thoughts.
So I think I might have an idea of this question, and because you maybe alluded to it a little bit, but who exactly is this technique for?
So we're going to be talking about it within the context of therapy and healing, but really, hopefully, like a loose application that some people can gather, can apply this in different ways. Educators, and that is a huge umbrella of a lot of different specialties and fields. Conversationalists, right? This
Yeah,
can help you develop a good ability to converse. Therapists, of course, and really anyone that is teaching. And if you think about it, humans, right? Because we're always teaching, we're always learning. And then not just on the relational level, but also within ourselves, kind of the relationship we have with ourselves and our thinking, right? Thinking about our thinking so that we can apply this, which is the main focus of our session or episode today, of then developing this for ourselves and questioning ourselves. And just to kind of add to that, Socrates himself, he says, I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think. Right. And that was a huge emphasis for him because he wanted to help someone. If you think about if you really love or care or want to help someone, it's helping them beyond them being dependent on you. Right. You want
yeah.
to be able to have them to be equipped to think and to fend for themselves.
So how do we? We've talked about Socratic questioning. We've talked about what it is, who it's for. So how do we go about applying this? What is the specifics of the technique themselves?
Yeah. So if we think about it within the context of therapy, I like to use the three C's. I like acronyms. I like things that are helpful to remember. So the three C's when it comes to challenging our thoughts while examining, challenging is catch, check, change. Right. So we catch our thoughts, which I'll reference. I think we have two other podcast episodes that talk a little bit more about thoughts. One simply on distortions. So that's a little bit about the catching part where I
Hmm.
can identify the distortion. And then we have one where you and Amanda talk about the importance of just changing our thoughts and how it's linked to our emotions and our behaviors. But catching is a little bit like the distortions. Checking, right? This is where the questions are going to really help with the checking. And you can't change unless you first check it. And a lot of times we loosely or quickly check them, but the questions that we're going to provide are going to be like you're in a debate of some kind. Or sometimes I like to use the analogy of you're putting your thought on trial and giving
Yeah.
it a fair trial by looking at all different sides. But many times we're very biased in our thinking. We jump to a conclusion and we don't check or examine those thoughts. And so, yeah, that's going to be the premise: catch, check, change. And then we're going to go through several questions to really challenge and to check our thoughts enough to develop a better way of thinking and a more accurate way of thinking.
What if just yeah, a question that sort of comes in my mind, for clients that are having some level of resistance to the idea that their interpretation of things needs to be questioned, right? How do we go about, maybe you as a therapist and or as somebody that themselves might be dealing with some narrow-mindedness or blindness, right, to your own distorted views and resistance to change. Anything to help with that specifically? Any
That's a big
thoughts?
question because, and this is where you can see the skill of a clinician, right? There are many
Yeah.
reasons why they might respond in that way. And
Hmm.
so it's really first understanding why are they responding in that way
Fair.
before just knowing exactly how to jump in. But I think what's important to, like, how to respond to that is in a very non-defensive way of like, hey, they're your thoughts, right? Going back to the sense of empowerment, like you can believe
Yeah.
whatever you want. That's ultimately your choice. I'm just here as a support, trying to guide you in a way that helps you meet your own goals, right? And so it's kind of like aligning with them. So be like, I'm not
Sure.
trying to just debunk your thoughts because that's sometimes what happens in therapy. It feels like you're trying to change their thoughts and they have to adopt, what you say is right. But it's saying, hey, and that's why this approach is really helpful because you're not telling them what to think. You're asking them questions to help stretch their thinking. So some people will say often that one goal of therapy, it's not the goal, but one goal is cognitive flexibility. Because too
Sure.
often we're very rigid. So that's a little bit of what you're describing. We could be too
Yeah.
rigid. How do we loosen that up? Because that's all that we've known, that's how we think. So for someone to come in and challenge that can be challenging. And so it's just using questions to be like, "Hey, what do you think about that?" Sometimes I'll say, "I'll just leave that there if they're really resistant. I'll just chew on it." Right? Like, just think about it because I'm not here to change your thinking. I'm just here to support you in thinking for yourself.
Yeah, and this idea of cognitive flexibility, for those that are unaware of the concept, it's basically, one's ability to consider alternate points of view, essentially, right?
Yes.
Consider a different dialogue, right? Because oftentimes we become so stuck in the narrative that we're telling ourselves about whatever it might be, right? So we have a particular thought about ourselves, about somebody else, about society at large, about the world, about whatever, right? And that particular thought will have its consequences, if you will, and it could have its pros and it can have its cons. And there are other viewpoints that would also have varying degrees of pros and cons, right? And so somebody that is ultimately the most cognitively flexible will be able to take a step back, look at the greater picture, if you will, see multiple different points of view, and be able to sort of decide which one works for them in their situation, right? Which one has the most sort of pros and cons depending on whatever their goals are, right? And ultimately, when people are extremely rigid, generally it leads to a lot of downsides, right? When it comes to emotional health, social well-being, even in many cases like physical well-being, because they're just so narrow-minded. And so, yeah, hopefully these questions that we're about to go through, if you are somebody that is like that is extremely rigid, you can start to hopefully with a humble heart start to ask these types of questions and break down maybe some of those walls that you might have that's decreasing your ability to adapt to whatever your needs are emotionally and behaviorally.
And to
So
add to that, Jonathan, one thing that I often will do to kind of bring down some of that resistance and is I self-disclose. I'll say,
yeah,
I have distorted thinking, right? We all do. And I sometimes have very rigid thinking. And so I have to stretch my thinking. And so I say that now, even for the purpose of the listeners, to if you notice any of that resistance and be like, oh no, I'm right, or whatever it may be, which is happening too much in our societal climate right now as well, we all really need to step into any thought changing exercise with humility, right? We are all biased. Like the more
yeah,
that you learn about the brain and perception and interpretation, you realize we are all extremely biased. We see the world as, shaped by our past experiences and other belief systems that we have. And so I own it. I am guilty of being biased, and I use these strategies all the time. And so, really, there's no one who is exempt from using these strategies.
sure. So let's go through some of the questions, and I imagine it's a little more in depth than how does that make you feel, right? Which I know is sort of a classic. That's the
Yes.
classic sort of therapy question, like just. I've had some patients where they've said, "Yeah, the only thing they ever asked me was, how does that make you feel?" So we'll go into a little bit more depth than that for any of our listeners that we're assuming that might be the question that we ask. But what are some of these Socratic questions that we can start incorporating?
So, the first one is the biggest one, in my opinion. Like, you really need to be able to understand this one and apply it. And it's what is the evidence that my thought is true? What is the evidence that it is not true? So, really, it's two questions. And it's looking at both sides, right? This is where alluding back to what I had mentioned earlier about putting your thought on trial, right? If someone were to say, I think this person is guilty, right? And you're like, oh, I'm only going to listen to one side. That would be an unfair trial. How can we draw a conclusion, innocent or guilty, without
Hmm.
having the full picture, right? Both sides speak before drawing a conclusion. So before you jump to the conclusion, I'm stupid, what's the evidence that supports? What's the evidence against? And I love this strategy because some people, they come to therapy thinking that we're only emphasizing the positive. So let's just jump to the evidence against. Oh, you're not stupid. And they just list all the reasons why you're not stupid, which is helpful. But we first have to address the evidence that supports it. Because if there is evidence, you're like, and I had someone recently where they're like, I'm a failure. And then they listed all these things in which they failed. And I'm like, if we don't resolve those things, if we don't digest them and look at them, I don't it may not matter how many things we list on the positive side. I was like, "Wow, that is a long list." We need to work through those as well. But the key word here is evidence. Because some
Yeah.
people will say, "Oh, it's evidence I'm stupid that this thing happened. Like I failed the exam." So, is that really evidence for someone? If someone else fails the exam, is that stupid as well, right? Which is kind of another question as well. But basically, is it evidence? What's the definition of stupid? And does this support for and against the whatever the thought may be? So that's the first one. Do you have any comments on that one, Jonathan?
No, I think that one's pretty straightforward.
Yep. Okay. So the next one is, as you were mentioning earlier about perspective taking, kind of looking at different sides. What's another way to look at this, right? This is a really humble question. We might jump to a certain interpretation. This is what's right. What's another way to look at this? Is there an alternative explanation? Thinking about politics today, where we might, be very, you know, rigid about a certain belief. Why are other people believing the way that they're believing? Taking perspectives, looking at kind of like the same thought from different angles, right? What's another way to look at this to stretch your thinking instead of this is the way, this is how it has to be? What's another way of looking at this?
Yeah, and if you're really struggling with this particular question personally, so say you're doing like a thought or mood journal or whatnot, and you're writing these questions down, and you have a particular thought about something that's kind of distressing you, and it's really hard for you to see outside of that particular narrative. There's a couple strategies that you can take, and I imagine you can probably come up with some more, Katie. One would just be waiting until you're in a different frame of mind, right?
Yep.
Sometimes, especially if you've just had, say, an argument with a partner or whatnot, you're gonna feel a particular way about them, and in that moment, it's like it's really hard to think of anything other than they're a jerk.
Mm.
However, if you wait a day, right, you might have a different, more nuanced perspective about the situation. So that would be one option, is just giving it a little bit of time. Even going out, getting some fresh air under a different context, right? That can sometimes be helpful. Another thing is to bounce the idea off of somebody else. And so a therapist obviously is a great person to be able to do that with. Um, but there's plenty of other options too. You could call a friend. You could ask said partner. Hopefully they're not the person you're particularly upset with in that moment, right? Or somebody just that you generally respect, right? And or somebody that is going to have a difference of opinion. And the point there is not to like call and get in a fight and get in a disagreement. It's really just to say, okay, how would you take this? I'm not here to question why you're believing the way that you do. I'm not here to correct you or anything. I just want to listen and hear what your immediate response is. And sometimes that can start to break down those walls of you being stuck in a particular viewpoint.
Very good points. Touching on the last one, we often call this the survey method, that we typically do this quite naturally. Like, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? Or my husband just said this, and you're sharing with a friend, and maybe you're not looking for an alternative way of looking at it, but that friend might
Yeah.
share that, right? So we do this naturally in our human relationships. But we can also do this in a way that we search for people that confirm our biases, right? So
Yeah, the
we have
echo
to be
chamber, right?
intentional. What was that?
Yeah. I said the echo chamber, right? So if you're doing this just to get people to agree with you, you're not doing it correctly, right?
Yes.
You should be surveying, ideally, right, something that's going to give you honest feedback.
Yeah.
And you need to be the type of person in that scenario that is able to receive said honest feedback without becoming defensive or guarded or whatnot.
Yes. So looking for objective feedback, if you do reach out to ask, what is an alternative way of looking at this?
I'm going to throw one thing out there that many of our listeners may not have thought to ever do, and might feel a little bit weird about doing this. But if there isn't really somebody, like saying you're having a hard time finding a therapist like Katie, right, or another really good quality therapist, right, or you don't really feel like there's somebody that you can trust to do this survey technique with, you can always use AI. And I know that might sound weird, but AI is pretty objective, in the sense, right? It's not a human being, and so you're not going to offend AI, right? And hopefully, and you might be able to get some pretty interesting feedback from it if you kind of plug in some of those questions and see what it spits out with. I've seen that to be a pretty useful tool for some people.
And they have that tool kind of built into some mental health apps right now, right? That you
Yep.
can plug that
Hmm.
in. And one other version to this question, which is later on our list, but it fits very well, is if blank, if a friend's name was in in the same situation, and had this thought, what would I tell him or her? Right. So it's still kind of taking a different perspective, but it's slightly different, and saying, okay, what can I get outside of myself for a moment and think, okay, well, if it was happening to them, what would I say? Because it's sometimes easier to be a more objective. It's kind of like that double standard method where we might
Yeah.
say, oh, I'm so stupid. If a friend did this, I wouldn't tell them that they're stupid. So, oh, maybe I'm being too harsh on myself. So it's a good way to kind of also take another perspective or find that alternative way of looking at things.
Good. Let's go through a few more of these questions, maybe more rapid fire. Okay.
Yeah. So the next one is great for catastrophizing. What's the worst thing that could happen? You're like, "What?" But then it's, "What, you could go through it, then say, "What could I do then? Could I live through it?" But then also, because again, flexing your thinking, then what's the best that could happen? And then finally, what will probably happen, or what's the most realistic outcome? So, worst, best, what's most likely? And I love that one because it stretches and thinks
Yeah.
of all the different scenarios. That one's great for catastrophizing.
Yeah, that seems like a great thought exercise because you're not necessarily trying to agree with the best and the worst necessarily, but you are just trying, as you sort of said, stretch your imagination to even open up the possibility of you taking a more sort of shades of gray approach.
Yeah. The next one I really like, of who told me this or when's the first time I had this thought? Because many times our thoughts really come from a parent, right? Or a traumatic experience or some other narrative that we just continue to believe without examining. And so it can kind of stop us in our tracks. So like who told me this, right? Or where when did I first believe it? Where does this come from? And that can kind of shift our perspective like this is my critical dad and I know that he was overly critical, and so if I don't trust what he says, why am I still saying that narrative to myself, right? That
Mm,
tape that's on repeat. All right.
that's good.
The next one, what's the effect of my believing this thought? In a Christian context, you might ask the question, why would Satan, the enemy, want me to believe it, right? But either way, it's trying to think what's the consequence of me believing it. And sometimes when we see the consequence, we're like, oh, this isn't very helpful. It might be true, but is it helpful to believe? What would be the consequences? And owning, right, what I'm choosing to think and what might be the consequences of that thinking. And sometimes that could be very insightful.
Yeah, this one to me seems particularly relevant, especially in like a marriage
Yeah,
context.
good example.
It's very very easy to see the almost immediate consequences of the beliefs that you have about your spouse, right? And so there can be some definite truth if you have a negative view of your spouse, but it's not going to be in many cases unless it drives you to appropriately communicate and work through said issue. It's often going to have pretty dire consequences as it can create all sorts of conflict between you and your partner.
Yeah, and really any relationship, right? Because a lot of
Yeah.
these distortions are barriers in our relationships. Now, another question that kind of goes along with it would be what could be the effect of me changing my thinking? I love that one, right? Because it's like, okay, well, what would be the effect of this negative thought? But also, what would be the effect if I changed it in a more truthful, helpful
Mm.
manner and thinking through the consequences on both sides? And then kind of again, for those that are Christian listeners, you could ask yourself, what would God say in this situation, right? What does God's word say? And so sometimes that can be an immediate, like, wow, this is completely contrary to my belief as a Christian. And then the last question, which really then motivates us to action, what can I do about it? And I love this one because it stretches our thinking, yes, but more so doesn't leave us stuck in our thinking, right? It's like, okay, whatever it is I'm thinking, what can I do about it? What would be good to do now? And I see a lot of my clients getting stuck in their thinking and just kind of in a loop without saying, okay, let me stop that for a moment and stretch my thinking to think, well, what can I do about it? And a way to kind of summarize a lot of these questions that sometimes my clients are like, oh, it's too many to remember. I'm like, okay. I gave these three questions to one of my clients and not in this order. And this client was like, oh, that stands for THC. And I was like, oh. So sometimes I'll give presentations on like THC, the secret to mental health. And some people are like, oh no, what is she going to talk about? But then sometimes I get into trouble because a client will be like, what did you teach me? LSD? I'm like, no, no, the other drug. So
Funny.
THC stands for, is it truthful? Is it helpful? Is it in my control? So summarizing some of those questions to stretch our thinking like quickly, is this thought truthful? If not, change it. Number two, maybe it is truthful, but number two, is it helpful? If not, change it. And then number three, is it in my control? Can I do something about it? And if yes, do something. If not, accept that you can't and move on. So, just a way to summarize a lot of the different Socratic questions we've already talked about.
That's really good. And I think that's probably the part that most of our listeners will take away is that Katie is an advocate for THC.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, that's really good stuff, Katie. Any closing thoughts that you'd like us to take away?
Yeah, so I like to, summarize a lot of these things too, from Philippians 4:8. Even if you're not a Christian, it's a really helpful list that goes through, it says, whatever things are true, that's the foundation, whatever things are honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable. I like different versions where you can kind of get different adjectives. So it says
Yeah.
like just, worthy of praise, excellent. And then it says, think or meditate on these things. And so it's helping you direct your mind to what kinds of things, what kinds of thoughts should I be thinking? And I think that's a good way to summarize one of the goals that we have for therapy in the thinking that you have to really rewire your brain to focus on these things. And then these questions can help you in achieving that. But I just want to encourage our listeners to really be humble enough to stretch their thinking, to recognize, hey, we're all biased. How do I really start to evaluate my thoughts? And we don't have to evaluate all 60,000 thoughts, but we can look at the main patterns or the ones that cause us a lot of distress, especially those in our relationships. And when we implement the strategy of Socratic questioning and thinking about our thinking and analyzing it, we can develop a healthier mindset where maybe instead of 80% are negative, 5% are negative, right? And so that's just an encouragement. I think a lot of practicals is one of the most practical things that people can, one of the episodes that they could just listen to and just adopt, or maybe choose a few questions that they like the most and just start applying it as they think about their thinking.
Yeah, remembering the THC thing again, I think truthful, helpful, is it in your control? That's obviously something that is easy to memorize and can really be applied in any context. Some of those other questions in terms of maybe the more complex or in-depth ones, if you write them down, say in your phone or in a journal or whatnot, then it's easy to have them with you when appropriate. I know a lot of my clients, and I'm sure yours as well, might spend a few minutes before they go to bed, right, just thinking about the day and sort of maybe the challenging things that they had, and then they'll apply the thoughts that they have to some of these questions. I would add just one more thing, in part because this has been helpful for me. But going through this exercise, particularly while exercising, has been something that's been profoundly useful. There's just something about doing it in the context of exercise. For me, particularly, it's running, when I get even more valuable. And I think there's something about, the neurotransmitters that are being elevated, or just maybe the fact that I'm fatigued, or maybe the fact that it's really hard to get kind of offended by my own thoughts that I can come up with when I'm running. That makes this process seem that much more efficient or useful when I do so. So there's just a little bit of a tidbit of sorts for those that are avid exercisers out there.
Awesome.
All right, well, thank you, listeners, so much for and those on that are on YouTube or watching the video podcast. We thank you so much for being with us today. We hope you found this information inspiring and helpful on your journey to grow in your mental health. And we look forward to having you again next time.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe. Your engagement will help us reach more people who need encouragement. To hear more episodes, learn about our other mental health resources, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.